we're asking these social workers, who are mostly female and have often got families of their own, to absorb the stress of the mess that our society's in. And why should they? For 30 grand a year, which just about pays their electricity bill and their rent. I mean, it's based on, I used to say the system's based on female martyrdom. And I still think there's quite a lot in that.
Conversations around austerity can sometimes feel quite nebulous or abstract. Some people don't even think it's real, that it never happened. Of course, there are many professions where they can offer concrete examples, explanations, stories of what austerity meant. I'm thinking nurses, doctors, firefighters, teachers. Today's guest absolutely falls into that category, but the area in which they worked for decades is often neglected in conversations around austerity, namely child protection. Teresa Thornhill is a barrister. She's written a memoir. It's a great book, In Harm's Way, the memoir of a child protection lawyer. Such an extraordinary insight, for my money, into something we all care about, but know too little in regard to. Every once in a while, a story will come out of nowhere, a tragedy invariably, of a child who's been let down by the system. So what does child protection mean? Are we protecting children adequately? How do things go wrong? And how can we improve the system? Teresa Thornhill, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you.
I am so looking forward to this conversation. I read your book. You asked me just before we began this interview, did you read it? We always read the books here on Downstream. It was very different to the kinds of thing we normally discuss here on Novara Media, but of huge interest, I think, and will be hugely informative to our audience. It's a memoir of a child protection lawyer. Let me get it in shot. In Harm's Way. Child protection. I think people watching or listening will have some understanding of what that is. Can you just briefly go over child protection services and what your job or your series of jobs were over several decades?
So child protection is the system whereby the state intervenes in the parenting of a child or children. It's done by children's social workers who are specialist social workers within specialist teams within local authorities. There's various stages to the process. So everybody who has contact with children, including school nurses where they still exist, dentists, GPs, school teachers, health visitors, if they've got concerns about the well-being of a child, they are supposed to report them to the nearest local authority social worker. And depending on the level of concern, there may be what's called a Section 47 investigation, which is an investigation to find out the circumstances in which the child is living and how things are for that child. The lowest level of intervention is where a child is classified, it's all rather cold terminology, as a child in need, but people talk about it as CIN. So if your child is classified as CIN, that means you're entitled to, or the child is entitled to some support service, but it may be very low level, particularly these days when resources have been run into the ground and there are very few resources available. That's not child protection as such, but it means you'll have some contact with authorities. It may not be with a social worker at that stage once the child's been called CIN. It might be with a family support worker who's an unqualified person who's had a little bit of training in working with children. I mean, they're often extremely good. I'm not knocking them. I just mean that they're not qualified social workers. So they might do the work with a child in need. And if the concerns increase, the social worker will be informed and may call a child protection conference. And at that stage, the child might be put on a child protection plan under, there are various categories: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. But it's a multi-professional conference. So typically, depending on what the concerns are, invited to the conference would be school teacher if the child's of school age, or nursery staff if they're younger, midwife and if it's a baby. But let's assume it's a slightly older child, possibly the GP, although most GPs would be too busy to attend, but depending what the concerns are, the GP might attend. So it's a mixture of professionals who are called together by the local authority social worker and the social worker's manager, and they discuss the concerns, and then they decide collectively whether the child needs to go on a child protection plan. And if the vote is for the child to go on a child protection plan, then the child is much more closely monitored. Not super closely, unless the concerns are very high level. If the concerns are massively high level at that stage, in fact, you'd probably go straight to care proceedings. But let's suppose they're sort of mid-level of concerns, that the child would be on a child protection plan and the family would be visited by a social worker, in theory at least, probably monthly. I'm assuming a family with one child. Obviously, sometimes there are 4 children or 6 children. Situations vary, and then if concerns get to a level where what we call threshold is crossed, this is under Section 31 of the Children Act 1989. That is the care proceedings section, and it sets out a threshold of that a child either is suffering significant harm or is likely to suffer significant harm. And if that threshold is thought to be crossed, the social worker should then consult her in-house lawyers, because every local authority has an in-house legal department with a specialist team dealing with children. And they will say, well, what's your evidence? Tell me all about this case, read the paperwork. And they should then give advice. Yes, you probably can make out the Section 31 threshold, or no, you can't. Bring me some more evidence. And if they say, yes, you probably can, or you do, your evidence does cross that threshold, unless the situation is very urgent, the next step is to go into something called the pre-proceedings process, which was brought in a few years ago, and basically means the local authority social workers have to do a lot more work before they issue proceedings than they had to before that existed. So in other words, a lot of the work that would have been done under the oversight of a judge is now done in a process that can last 3 months, can last 6 months, depending how things go.
A child in need, so what does that look like? Because you're saying that's kind of like the first rung on the ladder in terms of concerns.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, because I've dealt with care proceedings mainly, I have not dealt with many children in need. I've sometimes been in a case where things went well and the child, having been on a plan and subject to proceedings, then went back to being a child in need. So, I mean, for instance, a disabled child might be registered as a child in need because they need specialist services or they need adjustments made to their home. But it might be a child where, for instance, a newly arrived refugee family who are struggling, parents don't speak English, maybe the children are preschool. I mean, obviously we know refugees can come with a lot of trauma, but that's not always recognised by the system. But they might have any level of need which meant that a bit of extra attention for the children would be useful.
So it doesn't necessarily denote negligence or bad parenting. It could be a panoply of things.
It doesn't have to. Yeah. It can be a panoply of things, but it means that the child, I mean, pretty much what it says on the tin, the child is in need of some additional support.
So if I have a child and they're in school, they're 5 years old, and it comes to the attention of a teacher that they have bruising on their arm, and there's a logical inference that it's been caused by an adult, what happens then?
The teacher will be have had it dinned into him or her that they've got to go straight to the head or whoever's standing in for the head if the head's not around that day, and then the person with child protection responsibilities within the school will contact the local authority social workers, who will come down there pretty fast. And
that would meet the threshold, presumably, if there's physical evidence of
Well, it
assault.
it might not. It's difficult to generalise, but there would have to be a referral to the local authority, and depending on what the child was saying, I mean, if the child's saying to the head teacher, you know, I had a bit of a fight with my little sister and she pinched me, that would cause less concern than if the child said, Daddy punched me this morning and it was really painful. But it's not only what the child says, it also depends how bad the bruising looks. And very likely, when the parent comes to pick up the child at the end of the school day, they're going to find a social worker there saying, look, we want to take your child for a medical.
What kind of judges are involved in these proceedings?
Care proceedings. Shall I just go back to so that it's easy enough to follow? From pre-proceedings, if things don't improve, then usually care proceedings are issued.
Yeah.
In the family court, there are 3 tiers of that court based on the 3 tiers of court that existed before it was called the family court, which is only a few years now. So the bottom layer is lay magistrates who are... they're not lawyers or social workers. They're volunteers who get a little bit of subsistence for every day they work. They're generally people who can afford to work unpaid and who have chosen to go to do this and have gone through a certain amount of a grilling, I believe, in the recruitment process. Obviously, I've never done it, so I don't have personal experience of that. And then they get an amount of training, but it's like a day here and a day there. It's not a huge amount of training. And then if they may be sitting in the criminal magistrates court and then apply for what's called a family ticket to sit in the family bit of the magistrates court, which it used to be called the family proceedings court. It isn't technically anymore, but that's the easiest term to use. So that's for the more straightforward cases. I mean, straightforward, I think, in inverted commas, because I don't know if you heard the news yesterday about Finley Boden, but his case was decided by lay magistrates.
Well, we'll talk about that more in a moment.
That. Yeah. So then the next layer up is either district judge or circuit judge. So it's what in the old terminology was the county court, and those are more complex cases. And again, a division between the district judge, which would have of that category of case, the slightly less complex, and the circuit judge would have the more complex cases. And then there's the High Court. For certain types of cases, have to go to the High Court, but most care cases are dealt with either at the magistrates level or at the what I still think of as the county court level. So district judge or circuit judge.
Do you think it's bad that lay magistrates aren't paid? Does that lead to particularly bad outcomes? I mean, you mentioned Finley Boden. We'll talk about that particular case, but it's clearly very relevant right now. Does it mean that you only recruit certain kinds of people? What are the downsides?
I think it's totally inappropriate myself. I think these decisions have such major implications for the child and the family, and sometimes even the extended family. Loss of a child to adoption can be devastating for grandparents and even more distant relatives. And to me, these decisions should be made by people who've had a lot of training and in not only the things that most judges know about, i.e. the law, but also in child development. And they need to have a lot of insight into the kind of communities that they're dealing with, because most of the families who come before the family court in care proceedings are from the most disadvantaged communities. And if you don't understand the social context in which these parents are trying to bring up children, I think you're at a disadvantage when you're trying to make a fair decision.
And what kinds of professions are they drawn from? Because maybe I'm showing my age here, but it does feel that over the last 10 years in particular, fewer and fewer people have the time, have the money, even relatively affluent people I can think of in, say, their 40s, 50s, with mortgage rates going up, bills going up, et cetera, et cetera. Very few people come to mind in terms of having the time to do this virtually for nothing. I know there are expenses and whatnot. So what kinds of professions are entering lay magistrates' positions?
I mean, I can't answer that, I'm afraid, Aaron. I haven't been in front of a lay bench for quite some time, and I mean, you don't get told what their professions are. You look at them and you make your own, probably, in my case, slightly prejudiced judgments. I would say mostly it's people over 60, although I myself am over 60 now, but it's often, I assume, with a partner who is earning the dosh so that they can afford to work for free. I wouldn't say they've all got a professional background by any means, which I don't actually think they necessarily need to have a professional background, but I think you need to be pretty bright and have a high level of insight. And, go back to what I said before, I think you should have a deep level of training.
So it's almost more like a hobby for some of them.
Well, I think so. Yeah.
For some of them. That's really interesting.
Mm.
What are the main causes of child neglect? I mean, that's a word we're going to return to a lot, neglect. But what are the principal drivers of this?
Well, I'm not a sociologist, but I would say poverty has a lot to do with it. I think there's a lot of research now which shows the link between poverty and child neglect. I mean, from what I've seen, my own little social surveys that I've done, an awful lot of the parents who are brought before the court in care proceedings are lone mums. I myself was a lone mum, so obviously I feel this quite acutely. Their lives are incredibly difficult. They don't, generally they're from impoverished backgrounds. They're often living in very inadequate housing and possibly having to move around. Many have been subjected to domestic abuse and have had to flee because of that. So that's created instability in their lives and their children's lives. I would say the pandemic, it probably made life worse for most people, but it certainly made it harder being a lone parent, and particularly if you're in poor housing, and particularly in big cities where you may have been in a small flat in a high-rise building with your children. We know that domestic abuse, the incidence of it, rose exponentially during COVID, and it's not hard to imagine why, really. And then, of course, the cost of living crisis has made life much more difficult for parents. And if you think of a lone mum who hasn't really got enough money to put in her prepayment meter, and her kids are hungry, so the kids are hungry and they're cold, and possibly she's worried about a violent boyfriend turning up and hammering on the window. I'm not saying that this will inevitably lead to neglect, but it may mean that she's a pretty stressed out mother, and stressed out parents, let's say, do a less good job than parents who basically feel things around them are okay, that they've got some support and they've got some finance.
So I think it's important to say this. I don't have the views I'm about to say. I'm not a conservative. I'm not Peter Hitchens. But there would be a conservative rebuttal to that, which would be, I agree entirely. That's all true. That's why we need to really emphasize and value family life, marriage, traditional values, because that's the best unit in which to raise children and to ensure a certain level of stability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would you say? Imagine I'm Peter Hitchens for a moment. What would you say to somebody that's giving you that counter-argument?
I don't think marriage has got anything to do with it. I mean, it's what I was talking about before is economic stability and having enough. You don't have to be rich to bring up your kids well, but you need some stability.
But on the lone, and my mum was a lone mum, but on the lone mum's point in particular, if they said that to you, well, that's why we need family and that's why we should venerate marriage, and family breakdown is an outgrowth of liberal reforms since the 1960s, blah, blah, blah.
I would say that's quite offensive to lone mothers, many of whom do a very good job. And presumably if they've decided to be lone mothers, they know they're doing a better job as lone mums than they would have done if they'd remained in a relationship with the partner who they've left, with the child's father. But I do think that a lot of, well, I mean, I can't put percentages on it, but there are women out there who need support and who aren't getting it. And obviously, if you've left a partner because of violence, it's not your fault. In fact, you've done the right thing. You've got yourself and your kids away. But we know there's a desperate shortage of places in women's refuges, and there's a desperate housing crisis in this country. And the support that you need may not be easily available.
It's so hard if you're on the left or a progressive on this issue, because on the one hand, I mean, I completely disagree with what somebody like Peter Hitchens might say. On the other, there are very real resource shortages that these people need. And I mean, that for me is an argument for socialised childcare, et cetera, et cetera. But it's, raising children is the hardest work out there, especially multiple children. Yeah. The idea that one parent can do it easily is for the birds. What are the costs of all of this? We talk about, we can't afford to invest more money in child protection, or, have more refuges for single mums and so on. Do you think when that conversation operates at that level that we're talking in terms of a false economy? I mean,
absolutely. Yeah. I think that we can't afford not to put more resources into it. I mean, if you look at some of those statistics I've set out, I think in the first or second chapter of the book, In Harm's Way, a quarter at any one time of the prison population is made up of people who have been in care at some point in their lives, not necessarily the whole childhood, but they've had experience in care. There are extraordinary statistics for young people who are not in education, employment or training. 39% of young people between, I think it's 19 and 21, who have spent time in care are in that category. compared to 13% of the population who are not care experienced between the ages of 19 and 21. So, I mean, with the better resources put into families much earlier, less children going into care, there would be more people in the workforce paying tax. That's got to be factored in. And then if we look at homelessness, drug addiction, I believe, and early death, premature death amongst people who've been in care is much higher than amongst the rest of us. I mean, it's not in the interest of us as a society to have a section of the community who've been so impoverished and neglected, both emotionally and physically, that they can't really contribute.
Are there more young people missing out? Are there more families that aren't getting the resources and services they need?
There are certainly more young people in care. The figures have gone up dramatically, and it's in about the last 13 years. I think it's a 30% increase in England and a 37% increase in Wales.
Wow.
Which is pretty dramatic. And I believe it's the County Councils Network are saying that they think by 2030, so 6 years from now, there could be 100,000. I mean, at the moment there are 83 and nearly 84,000 children, young people in care, and they think it could be 100,000. And for my money, it doesn't have to be like this, but we do have to put in more resources earlier. And also, I think, if you look at it in purely economic terms, leaving aside the humanity argument, if you put resources in when a parent maybe is pregnant or when they're first seen to be struggling, you may well be able to avoid the costs of care proceedings. Care proceedings are expensive. Every time me and my colleagues used to go to court, it's costing the state between £5,000 and £10,000. I mean, I'm even just guessing the figures, but, we would sometimes sit because we used to have to wait a long time outside court pre-pandemic. And we would try and tot up what we each knew what we would be paid for that attendance at court. And then we'd tot it up between, say, 5 or 6 of us, and then think about the judge's salary and the court clerks and the building and all the rest of it. It's expensive. And that's just for an interim hearing. For a final hearing, it's much, much more. Why pay the money once things have got into crisis? Why not nip the crisis in the bud? And I profoundly believe it can be done. And if I can talk a bit about the Pause Project.
Please, go ahead.
Their work is very, very interesting. They're a charity for whom I have a lot of admiration. They work with women who've already lost one child in care proceedings, or sometimes more than one. And they operate in about 20%, I think that's right. Yes, 20% of local authority areas, because there's no duty on a local authority once a mother has lost a child in care proceedings to give her any support whatsoever, unless the end result is the child's going to be adopted. And that's fairly small. That's about 6% of cases, roughly.
Wait, so hold on. If a mum loses her kid, there's no aftercare, there's no
I mean,
therapeutic services?
No. The focus very much, and this is partly, I think, a not so good thing about the Children Act, 1989, that the focus is so much on the child that it kind of atomizes the child and forgets that the child is connected, especially young children. They're deeply connected to their parents. It doesn't treat the parents like that. So in the book, do you remember the story I told about Kylie G, who herself had a very abusive childhood? Local authority had tried to help when she was a child, but failed. The police had tried to help when she was sexually abused, but the guy had scarpered. Her mother didn't want to know. So she then went to live with the grandmother and then was, obviously very damaged because she'd witnessed a lot of domestic abuse and then being sexually abused over a period of years. And she then had 2 little boys in quick succession, very, very young. And at 21, the local authority were trying to remove them. And she, at the end, I think I describe it in, must be chapter 6 or 7, at the end of the case, when we lost and the children were going to be placed for adoption, I was alone with her at court because there's also no support now for lawyers, even in these difficult cases, even when it's obvious you're going to have a very, very distraught client on your hands. It's just you. So you're advocating and you're also passing the tissues and you're also trying to cuddle them at the same time, which is impossible. And she had run out of court just after the judge had announced his decision, but before he'd given his judgment. And I ran after her, but then as I had to go back into court to hear the judgment, she disappeared down the stairs. And I don't know to this day whether she killed herself that night. I mean, maybe she, I really hope she didn't. Maybe she's, in a new relationship with a child that she's been able to keep. But now I just don't know. But the lack of support, I think, is all wrong. And to go back to the Pause Project, they work with women who are referred to them to quite intensively for 18 months with each woman. And it's very relational. So they will have one of their caseworkers attached to or working with an individual woman and intensively for that period. And they might be helping. I mean, they say it's led by the mother. So depending what the issues are, they might be helping her with housing. They might be helping her to find a therapist, although how would that be paid for? They might be helping her find a drug agency if that's what she needed, or an alcohol agency. I mean, they do rather wonderful podcasts, and I heard one where the mother had actually really wanted to learn to paint, and they'd gone to painting classes with her. And they give statistics, they're very evidence-based, about how many mothers they think they have diverted from a situation where they would have gone on to immediately get pregnant again, have another child, and be immediately taken to court. And it's quite dramatic, actually. And to my way of thinking, if that can be done by that kind of intensive support with these women who, I mean, they're undoubtedly they're women who've had damaging childhoods. But if those women can be helped after they've lost a child, surely they could be helped before they've lost a child. It seems to me obvious.
And in your experience, if there's a young mum who has a child taken away, is there an impulse there because they've possibly or even very likely been deprived of love as a child? They are drawn to having something, creating something in their lives which adores them. Is that something which it's almost like they having to meet a human need by having another child as quickly as possible?
Well, that's what Nicholas Crichton thought. He's the district judge from Wells Street Magistrates Court in London. Sadly, he's no longer with us. He saw again and again, as judges do, that the same women were coming back, being brought before his court with the next baby and the next baby. And he says he had one mum from whom he was asked to order the removal of baby number 14.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that's normal, but it does happen. And he decided very much along the lines of what you're saying, that he felt there were certain women who could only, in fact, I think some women told him they could only deal with the pain of losing a child by going out and getting pregnant again. And he went off to Australia to some conference where he met, or he heard about an experimental system that was being done in the US with substance abusing parents, so drug and alcohol. And to cut a long story short, on the basis of the way they were dealing with those parents, I don't think this is across the US. I think it's in a particular state it was being tried. He created something which is called FDAC, the Family Drug and Alcohol Court. And he used to do it at Wells Street. And I actually sat in on it, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago. And the system was completely different. It was relational. It was based on the judge building up a conversational relationship with the parent, and there being a very strong team of support around the parent. I mean, it sounds quite similar to what Pause do in terms of the types of support that are being offered. And the way it's done now is that whereas what I'll call conventional care proceedings in the family court are have to be completed within 26 weeks or 6 months, within FDAC, the time period is 12 months, so twice as long, makes a huge difference. And there's much more attempt to work with the parent to bring them through their difficulty with drugs or alcohol or both. And instead of having, well, we don't have that many court hearings in the conventional court, but although we used to, but in FDAC, you go to court, the parent goes to court once a fortnight, and the judge says, well, how are you getting on? I've seen your drug test results. They're clear, well done, or they're not clear. I'm a bit worried, tell me what's going on in your life. So it depends on being a judge who's got really good communication skills and can talk to parents in a way that the parent will respond to and they don't feel patronized or humiliated. And I mean, Nick Crichton was absolutely brilliant at that. He was so good at that. He was like this sort of benevolent grandfather, unpatronizing. And when I sat in, it moved me to tears. I mean, it was amazing because you could just see the parent responding and really wanting to give him the news he wanted by having changed. So there's been research on the outcomes, and I mean, it is used for drugs and alcohol. It's not used for sexual abuse or physical abuse or, all the various other things. And question mark whether it could be. I mean, I think that's more tricky in certain types of abuse. But with drugs and alcohol, the research that's been done, both some years ago and only last year, shows better outcomes than in the conventional court. So I'm afraid I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but better outcomes in terms of less parents returning to their drug or alcohol abuse, more children being able to go home, because usually the children are in temporary foster care while the parent goes through this process, and less instances of repeat neglect or abuse for the families that get reunited and who've been looked at again a few years later, and things generally seem to, I'm not saying they always stabilise. There's no 100% solution in these situations, but FDAC seems to work better. And, I think it's because it's so relational. It's about human beings getting alongside other human beings. Whereas in the conventional family court, as it operates now, particularly with the 26-week time pressure and the huge pressure everybody in the system is under. I mean, there are good judges out there who do try to be certainly very well-mannered and pleasant to the parents, but they're so pressured and stressed, and everything happens so fast. And you don't get this business of dialoguing, which seems to have just made such a difference to those FDAC parents.
You mentioned this 26 weeks period.
Yeah.
Which when I read it, I mean, look, there's so much I read in the book, and I have to say it's one of the few times I've read nonfiction, and I read all sorts of horrible things about war and suffering and conflict, but I read your sort of schedule when you were a local authority lawyer, and after about 5 or 6 pages, I need a cup of tea, I need to sit down. It was very stressful. But there were also some insights where I didn't even put, NB, I just put exclamation mark. And one was this thing of 26 weeks, having to complete this process in 26 weeks. And, one of the things that when you're hiring in organizations, one of the stupidest things you can do is be in a rush and create an urgency bias. Because and it's a big cognitive bias, when you have an urgency bias, you make mistakes. And the most important thing isn't a good outcome, it's just finishing.
Yeah.
And we're building in an urgency bias into the process. And I thought, my goodness, has nobody thought this is kind of a stupid way to carry on? Or
I couldn't agree more, Aaron. But I mean, I think it's very much linked to lack of resources. I mean, it came about through a process of, as I understand it anyway, this is how it appeared to us. I was working in a local authority at the time as an in-house lawyer. And what we understood was that the senior judiciary had felt very criticised by certain journalists for the fact that some sets of care proceedings were undoubtedly dragging on far too long, 2 years, even 3 years in some cases. And obviously, I'm not saying that would have been okay. That was terrible for the children. Although, there are occasionally cases where just when you think it's all sorted and the children are going to go and live with X dies or something, it can happen that with the best will in the world, and before there was a 26-week timetable, the reasons for delay couldn't be avoided. There were also, though, I think it was a valid criticism that generally cases were taking too long. So they first shortened it to 40 weeks, and it didn't have the force of law. It was guidance. Try to finish your cases in 40 weeks. And as in-house lawyers, we sort of thought, 9 months, how are we going to do that? But it was probably a good thing. It gave us a bit of a kick in the backside that we had to make sure that our social workers were getting on with it, and we had to file everything on time. So it became a stricter regime. And I probably should have stayed like that. But then that wasn't good enough. And there was this new, very managerial-minded generation of judges who said, no, this isn't good enough. We're going to bring it down to 26 weeks and give it the force of law. So that came in. And that, I think, has really upped the sense of pressure. But you've got to see that combined with the lack of resources. I mean, if there were really good resources, plenty of judges, plenty of courtrooms, plenty of social workers, which we need to talk about in more depth because there's a terrible dearth of social workers, and plenty of foster carers, then the whole system could move at a reasonable pace, and plenty of experts who are willing to assess children, parents, paediatricians who are willing to look at photographs of broken bones and so on. I mean, there are a number of people involved in this system, and mostly they're in very short supply. In fact, I can't think of one group of professionals who aren't in short supply. And that comes down largely to money. I mean, I think the shortage of experts comes down also to the fact that some experts have had very bruising experiences, and that has put off other people from being family court experts. They've been very badly criticised in the Court of Appeal, and rightly or wrongly, but it's very difficult experience and humiliating, and your name gets out there in the law reports. So I think that has affected to some extent. And then also the law was changed to say that the courts had to be very cautious about endorsing the use of an expert, and they could, whereas before they could do it whenever they felt it would be helpful. The law was changed to say that you could only use an expert. An expert could only be instructed in a care case if it was necessary. And the meaning of necessary has been interpreted as just what it says on the tin. In other words, if you can avoid it, you don't do it. And this all comes down to costs. I mean, all the changes I'm talking about have coincided with the period of austerity from 2010.
So when was the 26-week sort of threshold introduced?
2014. So
it's very recent.
I mean, it's not that recent. It's been having quite an impact for quite a long time.
Yeah. Because there'll be, hopefully, politicians or aspiring politicians will be watching or listening to this. And when you say we need more money, they think, oh, God.
Yeah.
But when you say something like, actually 40 weeks is wise than 26 weeks, and that wouldn't, well, it would cost something because the process would be longer, but it wouldn't require more, a flood of investment. They might think, okay, that's interesting. I mean, that seems like a sensible way, and also to make it a guideline rather than legally specified.
Yeah. It would be better as a guideline. I mean, at the moment, the court can, or the parties to a case can apply for an extension, but they've got to have very good reasons. And this brings me back to the issue of magistrates, that when the 26 weeks was first brought in, and for a number of years after that, lay magistrates who are perhaps of a certain ilk were very, very keen to please the powers that be, and they come under the auspices of their local designated family judge, or DFJ, sorry about the jargon, and they would occasionally have meetings with him or her, and they wanted to show that their statistics were very good because they were getting through, say, the average duration of their cases was 26.5 weeks or 27 weeks, but whereas in the borough up the road or the county up the road, it was 32 weeks, so we're better. I mean, I know this sounds ridiculous, but it was very clear to us lawyers. Yes.
Because the costs of even just 10% of the kids you're processing, if that outcome is a bad outcome, the costs to the taxpayer, forget, like you say, the human part of it, are astronomical.
So the magistrates were incredibly zealous in enforcing it and saying, no, you're not having an extension, and no, you can't have this expert because it's not necessary in our view. The social worker can give this information about the emotional well-being or lack of it of the child or the mother's mental health crisis. Well, I mean, sometimes you do need an expert, and often you do need an extension. And in the old days, before this was brought in, we had this concept of planned and purposeful delay, which encapsulated situations where if you gave the parent a bit more time, they might be able to come off drugs, or they might be able to work through the grief they were feeling because they just lost some important person in their life. I mean, I'm just plucking examples out of the air, but there are times when parents actually have their own crises that are totally understandable. They need a bit of time and a bit of support. And to then say, well, then your children are going to have to be, we've got to have a resolution, 26 weeks. It's brutal.
You talk about SureStart Centres quite a lot in the book. Several times they come up. And SureStart is often bandied around by Labour politicians, is a big accomplishment of New Labour. I think for many people out there, they don't really know what they did or what difference they made. So why do SureStart Centres figure so prominently in terms of making life harder for the kinds of parents that you would often encounter in your job?
Well, I mean, again, I'm not a social worker, but my understanding is that a lot of young parents who were perhaps, with their first child and were struggling, got a lot of support from their local SureStart Centre, which was no longer available. I mean, it is partly to do with the amount that we move around in contemporary life, that a lot of people are having children quite a long geographical distance from their own parents who would in the past have helped. And it's to do with women having children very young. And obviously a lot of the parents, or perhaps it's not obvious, but a lot of the parents who come before the family court have themselves grown up in care, which I'm not saying they've been damaged more by the care system than by their own parents before they were removed. I mean, it's going to be different in every case, but these are parents who just need nurturing. I mean, it would be perhaps better if they delayed having children by 10 years. I would be an advocate of schools having an education program that would discourage teenagers, but you probably have to start when they were at primary school, from having children unless they really, really wanted it and they'd really got things sorted out in their lives. Because I think parenting is, like you said, it's the most difficult job there is. And to try and do it when you're 17 or 18 or even 23 is incredibly ambitious.
It's so interesting you say that, because we've just had a daughter last year. I was 39, my wife was 35.
Yeah.
So that's a bit older. And we made that decision because we wanted to be homeowners, have housing security, et cetera. But what's really interesting is obviously my wife, she went to the London School of Economics, so all of her friends are from a certain kind of milieu, broadly speaking. She's not, but broadly speaking, middle class, professional managerial class backgrounds and whatnot. And what they say is really striking. They weren't told as school children, actually, in terms of like fertility, what it means to delay children after 30, 35, 40. And the entire conversation was contraception. And there wasn't really, well, what does motherhood actually entail? What does it look like? How hard is it? When's the best time to do it?
Yeah.
The relationship between economic housing security and being able to raise children and so on.
Yeah.
So again, that's something that actually relatively low cost we should be looking to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot more useful than some of the things. For instance, my son, he's 24 now, he was obliged to do RE at school, religious education, up to the age of 16, I think. I think he had to do a GCSE in it. I mean, if instead of that, there had been quite an in-depth parenting discussion going on over that period of time, I think it could have been incredibly useful. He's not a parent, but I think the whole issue about how difficult it is and how challenging it is, and would you want to do the moment you leave school the most difficult thing that you're ever going to do in your life? Well, no, you wouldn't actually.
But it's funny that we don't teach kids certain things like that, or finances, or the meaning of credit card interest rates and what that can look like,
or how to vote, or what a local government is, or so many basic things that kids need to know we don't teach them.
You were a lawyer, as I said earlier. This was the most stressful part of the book for me. I mean, I cannot imagine what your life was like. There's almost like there's a snapshot of like a day in the life of a local authority child protection lawyer. And you had this job over multiple phases, but it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was the hardest after austerity, after 2010.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So what was that like, being a local authority child protection lawyer after 2010? Give me a day in the life as well, maybe.
I mean, I was lucky, and I can live on very little money, so I only ever did it 3 days a week. I would have gone nuts if I tried to do it 5 days a week, but most of my colleagues did it 5 days a week. It was extremely stressful. I mean, obviously, I quite like advocacy, so I was happier when I was working as a barrister representing parents, or even sometimes local authorities in court. I preferred being in court to being in an office, and that's partly personality. Some people, a lot of my colleagues didn't want to go to court. They would rather be in the office. But the state of the offices, certainly by 2011, 2012, we were incredibly overcrowded. We didn't have support staff, or we only had very minimal support staff, and we could see how stressed they were. There was quite a strong camaraderie, and certainly in most of the places I worked, there were good relationships between the lawyers and the minimal support staff. But that made it even harder to say, look, you've got to send that fax because I've got to go and give advice on this. I just can't send it. If you really like the person and that they've got a pile of things up here and they've been typing flat out all morning, that gets more difficult. And then the fact that the local authority, I mean, as an in-house lawyer, I was always working for giving advice to social workers, and social work departments, for reasons I don't know, constantly restructure. So let's say in 2011, there would be 5 different area offices in a city. 6 months later, they would amalgamate them and there would be one big office. And then another 9 months would go by and then there'd be 10 little offices. And, you can imagine the stress that caused to the individual social workers, because they're constantly having to move office, they're constantly having different managers, different support staff. As far as they had it, they didn't have much support in the way of support staff, and different systems being imposed on them. And that would feed back to us because often the management within social work departments was so weak. We, as the lawyers, would end up supporting the social workers who would bring us in tears and say, you know, I haven't seen my manager for 3 weeks and I don't know what to do about this case, and can I run it past you? And you're meant to say, no, you've got to find a manager. You know, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a social work manager. But inevitably, we did sometimes just listen to people and give them advice, give them support.
You said management was weak. What do you mean by that? And we're talking about line managers here. I mean, we'll talk about different kind of management in a minute, you know, the sort of head honchos.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Well, there wasn't enough managers, or there was a culture of mismanagement, or?
Well, I mean, I've worked in, I don't know, probably more than half a dozen different local authorities, because I also worked as a locum later on.
Which is a freelance kind of...
Yeah, it means I didn't have a permanent contract.
Yeah.
I was then working through an agency and moving around more.
Yeah.
The general structure is a team of social workers. Let's say if it's to capacity, it would be 6 social workers and then a team manager. Or this is in one structure that I've encountered quite a lot. Often in a team of 6 posts, funded posts, there would only be, say, 2 or 3 social workers actually in post because the others would have left and they couldn't recruit. So you've then, so I'm not exaggerating. So you've then got 2 or maybe 2 full-timers and 1 part-timer trying to manage the caseload that 6 people should have been expected to manage. And then the person managing them, the team manager who's above them, but should be on the spot and there and would have to be very hands-on in that situation. I mean, some fantastic, always there, you know, always go to court with their social workers, back them up to the hilt. But I would say that is, in my experience, less common than a manager who's either there but very weak, or frequently off sick, or it's just that post is vacant. So it puts the most inordinate amount of pressure on the people at the bottom of the social work structure.
It's really extraordinary. I mean, the way you describe child protection, I mean, it just sounds like the most dysfunctional work environment, the most dysfunctional management environment. And these are not life and death decisions. You know, it's not the NHS, but it's pretty damn close, taking people's children off them.
It's pretty close, I think, to life and death decisions, actually. I mean, for the children, well, for the parents too, but I mean, for the children, if it's wrong, it can cause long-term, lifelong grief and mental health issues.
So you just said a moment ago that normally, or in this one instance that you had first-hand experience of, you'd have a team of 6 social workers, 1 team manager, team leader, but they might just have 2.5 people working in that team. So what does their workload look like? How many hours a week would they be working?
Well, ridiculous hours. I mean, I haven't had a lot of recent conversations with social workers, but I would say 60 hours a week was probably pretty common, probably more in some cases. I think a typical caseload would be maybe 20 children, which doesn't necessarily mean 20 families. It might be 4 in one family and 1 in another and so on. But that's too many children for the social worker to build relationships with the children. Social work should be relational, and it isn't any longer. It's basically crisis management. And that is not the fault of social workers. That is the fault of the system, which, I mean, do you want me to get on to give you my thoughts about social work and what needs changing?
We're going to talk about it anyway,
Yeah.
so if you want to do that, go ahead, please.
Yeah. As you know, social workers are leaving the profession in droves and have been for a long time. So there's a huge retention problem. And a lot of young people who go into social work don't even complete the training. They realise that it's not for them, and they leave before they've even completed the training. There are various different routes into training. Do you want me to run over those?
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
No, it's all
So
very informative.
There's a social work degree, 3 years, where obviously, like every other degree, you have to get a loan and pay your fees, and you come out with a lot of debt. There is a newish thing called a social work apprenticeship, where you're working as an unqualified worker within a local authority, and you sign up for this program. So I believe you go on day release to college, and that, I don't know how long that takes, but presumably that takes longer. And I don't know what the academic requirements are for that, but presumably they're a little bit lower than for the degree. And then there are 2 postgraduate schemes. And the one I know most about is Frontline, which was started by Josh McAllister, I think his mum was a social worker, and he'd gone and done Teach First, which you probably know is a teacher training for graduates where you go into a school and you train on the job, and it's pretty intense. He thought, well, we need something like that for social workers. And I believe the idea was to train a kind of elite of more academically educated social work managers. And I think there's nothing wrong with that as an idea, but I just don't accept that only the social work managers need that level of training, I think, and that level of academic ability, let's say, because I think everybody can have so much influence as a social worker, for good or for bad, that absolutely everybody needs a high level of training. There's a separate issue about whether you should have to be a graduate, because that then excludes a lot of people who've come from backgrounds where they lived in areas where the education was very poor and they didn't get to university. I think that would be a huge problem. So I think there needs to be a non-graduate way in. But the way Frontline operates is that they take graduates with 2-1 or above, and they give them like 5 or 6 weeks, very intensive training about the theoretical background, and then you're sent to a placement in a local authority. And at that point, a lot of the quality of what you're getting depends on who your manager is within the local authority. So one woman I know went into a local authority where she had an exceptionally good manager, and she's thrived, and she felt well supported. She was given easy cases to begin with, and then they got a bit more complex, and she constantly felt that this one had her back. I know someone else who's had the opposite experience and has been put under the most appalling amount of pressure to do very, very complex work before she's completely trained. It's 1 year to get the qualification, but a second year gives you an MSc, and obviously it's better if you can do the 2 years. But again, the pressure that people are put under before they're ready for it, and without proper managerial support, can be absolutely appalling. And I don't think that just applies to people who've done Frontline. I think that probably applies across the board to newly qualified social workers.
Well, you said the caseload could be 20 kids. And obviously that's a lot of work. You said 60 hours, but also I think of the sort of mental anguish. Obviously, the more clients that you have, the more troubling stories you're going to be encountering at any one time. And it almost feels like, you would have PTSD by default by working as a social worker in the system as it's presently comprised. Is that the case, do you think?
Yes,
absolutely. You said crisis management's the default now.
Well, crisis management in the sense of there's not much chance to do social work with families and try and divert them from care proceeding. There's just, we haven't been able to get round to you, but now we see that your child's got a bruise or is telling the school something horrible is happening at home and we've got to rush to court. That's what I meant about crisis management. But I think for social workers, and probably also for lawyers, PTSD is probably pretty common. I mean, if you've got a good manager as a social worker, they should be providing a level of emotional support and noticing if you're looking more and more drawn, or you're going to the pub more and more quickly after work, or you're chain smoking. But because there's often this weakness at the level of team manager, and also the team managers are hugely burdened. From what I hear and what I've observed, a lot of people don't get the support that they need. And to do this kind of work, you need a lot of support. And I would say you also need some sort of bit like psychotherapists have supervision where they can offload about clients from whom they're absorbing too much vicarious trauma. I think social workers should have that.
I mean, it's crazy to me that they don't.
Yeah. Well, I can't say that none of them do. I think because some managers do it, and I think probably some local authorities offer counselling. If you had a particularly difficult case, you can have some counselling for, a few weeks maybe. And certainly some local authorities offer that to lawyers. One that I worked in did actually offer that to lawyers. I don't think anyone took them up because there was a sort of, we're lawyers, we don't need that sort of that was some years ago.
Because I was talking about child protection yesterday. I was doing some TV and we were talking about Finley Boden and that case, because obviously that's risen to public prominence recently. And I was opposite a Tory peer. And I found it fascinating because I said, look, we should be putting more money into child protection because it's a false economy and we need to invest in the future. And it's just a common sense economics argument. I'm sorry. I'm willing to budge on this or that, but some things like child protection I just do not understand why you wouldn't want to put more money in there. She said, no, it's not just about the money. And we can talk about that in a moment, because some things aren't about money. It's not always about money, most of the time, but not always. And it was interesting to me because she was saying, no, they shouldn't have more money. She had a lovely haircut. She had a Mont Blanc pen. And before we went on air, she was talking about how she was staying at the Carlton Club in central London and how the rooms aren't so great and it's £350 a night. And I'm thinking, my goodness. And you don't think we should be putting more money into child protection? But anyway, I said to her, I said, I wouldn't do that job. I said, I would not do social work, given the way that it's presently constructed. I think it's obviously very valuable, important work. But as that system looks right now, I said, I wouldn't do it. You couldn't pay me enough to do it.
Yeah.
And so I suppose a question arising out of that for me is, okay, so you've highlighted deficiencies in management. You've said that they need more people, and presumably you think they need to be paid more. If you were to rank those, what would they be? So if there's a politician, they're coming to you, they're saying, Teresa, I want to sort out child protection. Which of those three is the most important?
Well, it's got to be all three, I'm afraid. I can't put one thing into it because, I mean, I think pay should be a lot higher because basically we need the most able people to go into social work. It's probably one of the most difficult jobs there are. You need so many qualities that are very rarely found in one person. You need to have amazing communication skills so that you can communicate with a distraught toddler, with a high court judge, with an angry father who's wanting to throw things or maybe actually throwing things at you, with the police who don't want to come out and help you when you're doing a dangerous home visit. I mean, you need amazing skills. You need amazing resilience. You need a lot of holidays, in my opinion. I mean, I've said in the book, I think 3 months a paid sabbatical every 3 years would redress the danger that you leave due to burnout quite substantially.
Something to look forward to, right? You think in 6 months I can...
Yeah, and just actually to recuperate if you
Changes
can
the whole
afford
thing.
to. Yeah. Otherwise, we're asking these social workers who are mostly female and have often got families of their own to absorb the stress of the mess that our society's in. And why should they? You know, for 30 grand a year, which just about pays their electricity bill and their rent. I mean, it's based on, I used to say the system's based on female martyrdom. And I still think there's quite a lot in that. So I would say much higher pay, but also much more in-depth training. And I mean, some of that training can be on the job, but training, not just you go and deal with our excess caseload, please, and we won't be there to support you. Proper training. Because it seems to me that at the moment, and Josh McAllister said this in his independent review into children's social care, he said very clearly there needs to be a support framework. He calls it an early career framework, which supports a newly qualified social worker for the first 5 years. And I mean, if you take, I don't know, 3-year degree or 2-year postgrad plus 5 years support, you know, that's quite a long training. I'm thinking about doctors. Well, yeah. And I mean, I'm not saying doctors should be paid less, but I think social workers' jobs are probably as difficult and carry as much responsibility. I mean, you can mess up somebody's life completely.
How much should they be paid? You said 30,000 is a sort of ballpark figure.
I don't think I can answer that really, Aaron, but I mean, I think, I mean, what's the GP paid now? 90 grand or something like that? I mean, I think social workers, it should be a well-paid and high-status profession, actually. You know, why does a lawyer get paid more than a social worker? I mean, the life of a lawyer is not more difficult.
It certainly sounds slightly easier according to this book. Crikey.
Yeah.
That's real food for thought. Because it's just so hard. You know, on the one hand, you know, we were talking about Finley Boden, and you know, the host was saying it's appalling, and it's quite trendy. My mum, by the way, was a child protection social worker.
Oh right.
It's quite trendy now to bash social workers, and I'm very happy to criticise an individual if I think they've made a mistake. And obviously, there are some people who go into that game because, and you say that in the book, they want power. You know, they want to. There are people go into that industry for the wrong reasons. But that's not true for the most part. And I think that was such a beautiful formulation you just said about the system's built on female martyrdom. And the instinct of the host, anyway, was to basically slag off the social workers. And in the case of Finley Boden, I said, actually, well, they suggested that he should go back to his parents over, I think, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. And it was the Guardian and the magistrate who said, no, it should be sooner.
Yeah, but I've just been reading the report on the train. I've only read about a third of it. But my initial thought was that it was the Guardian that screwed up. But actually, the reason the Guardian said, well, let's make it a shorter period of transition from whoever it was, I think it was grandparents, to the parents' care, was because the 26 weeks was running out. The local authority had said, let's give it 4 months, and that was going to take the case way beyond the 26 weeks. Wow. So the Guardian, in order to get around that, knowing that a bench of lay magistrates wouldn't agree to this big extension because planned and purposeful delays last year or last decade, would insist, no, we've got to finish the proceedings on time, or, you can have a little extension, but not a big one. So the way to do that, the Guardian wanted to keep the transition within...
This is the Guardian of the Child, not the Guardian newspaper, just for people who aren't familiar with that.
The Children's Guardian wanted the court to have oversight of the process of the children being rehabilitated to the parents, which was sensible. I mean, I would have said that if I'd been involved in that. Any lawyer would say, yes, let's have the court having oversight. But the only way to do that was to reduce the time frame.
So if they weren't being rushed, maybe that child would still be alive.
Well, I think there were many factors, and I haven't
Obviously
finished reading the report.
But
It doesn't seem to me that it was very helpful that it had to be done according to a tighter time frame than the local authority were recommending. But there are other things which I've picked up from what I've read, and going back to what we've been talking about social work. I mean, there were 3 social workers involved. The first one was, let me try and get this right. The first one was newly qualified. The second, and I don't think they were like 1 and then she left, and then 2 and then she left. I think the first 2 were working together alongside each other. So one's newly qualified.
And it's a hard case, so that shouldn't be happening, ideally.
Well, I don't think it would probably look like a hard case at that stage. I think it looked like a sort of fairly bog standard case from what I've picked up. Depends what you call a hard case. Then the second social worker was not newly qualified, but new to children's social work. So I don't know what she'd been doing, adult mental health or elderly or something else. So, that's a big shock coming into child protection. And she had to do the assessment of the parents, and she didn't really know how to do it. And when she tried to get support from management, she didn't get it. She wanted guidance on, how do I write this assessment? She didn't get it. Obviously, it was in COVID. So, working conditions were very difficult for everybody in COVID. But it seems to me, and then social worker number 2 went off sick for 6 weeks. We don't know what with or why, or whether it was stress related. And while she was away, there were no visits to the children, who are actually, I think, living with the relatives at that point. So that probably wasn't disastrous. But then they got in an agency social worker to do a new assessment. And it was the agency social worker who said, I think these parents have changed, and I think that the children should be rehabilitated. So what a mishmash. And all the way through there were references to attempts to get management input and not getting it. And particularly when they were doing the care plans for the children. The care plan is, look, this is what we think needs to happen now. It's a document which says, we think little Susie needs X, Y, Z, needs to go and live with so-and-so and needs to have this much contact with parents and so on. And that should be done with close management oversight, and it wasn't. So I feel the Finley Boden case, from what I've read so far, is quite pertinent to what I've said in Harm's Way.
I mean, it's everything. It kind of distills most of the things that you said as functional with social work in this country and child protection.
Yeah. And if you just to be fair to the social workers, if you imagine how traumatic it would be to know that your mistakes, albeit for work that you'd done without the proper backing from management, had led to a child's death. I mean, that's just terrible.
For £30,000 a year in 60 weeks, 60-hour weeks.
Yeah. I mean, if I'd had a child who wanted to go into it, I would have said over my dead body, don't do this job.
Going back to management, because we talked about a certain layer of management, that line manager who'd be in charge of 6 social workers, but actually it turns out to be 2.5.
Yeah.
You say in the book that senior managers in local authorities, so it's a few rungs above that, didn't understand your work or didn't understand the nature of child protection.
Oh, that was legal department managers. Yeah. Yes.
So what does that mean?
Well, that they didn't really take on board the requirements of confidentiality. They expected us to work in very noisy, overcrowded, open plan environments where, sometimes you have to have very, let's say, disturbing conversations with a social worker or with another lawyer. And if you're doing it in an environment where, you've got the highways department sitting in the desks behind you, and you've got the, waste disposal sitting over there, and the I don't know, education there, it just doesn't provide the level of confidentiality to the families that they should have. And of course, it's highly stressful for the lawyer because, I mean, for anybody, I think, working in an open plan environment, I think it's well established. It increases your heart rate and it increases your risk of stroke and all the rest of it. It's just, these are not good working environments.
So did you not even have soundproof booths that you could go into? And
Oh.
That is incredible. Sticking with the management structure and dysfunction for one more moment, you talk about the timesheets.
Yes.
This was crazy to me. So explain the timesheets you had in this local authority.
Oh, I think it's every local authority I've worked in after a certain point in time.
So it's standardised, is it? Are they the same?
No, they're not the same. Every local authority does it differently, but they all talk to each other. You know, the senior people talk to each other over nice lunches and they decide, okay, we'll try bringing that in. So it's a kind of internal accounting system so that the legal department would charge the social work department for the amount of advice they needed. So in order to be able to do that, we had to record, you know, how long we'd spent giving telephone advice, how long we'd spent giving written advice, how long we'd spent photocopying, how long we'd spent on each case. And each case has a code. And then there's a funny little acronym for whatever the thing is that you're doing. And I mean, it was just yet another pressure. And, you know, and the downside of it in terms of children's well-being is that one local authority where I worked, we used to think, gosh, that social worker should have phoned us for advice much sooner, but possibly they were under pressure from their manager not to use up too much of the budget because everybody's working to tight budgets. And I mean, this was years ago. I haven't worked in a local authority for a long time.
And you said the timesheets consist of 6-minute chunks?
Yes.
6 minute, not 60-minute. It wasn't a typo.
No, 6 minute. No, it's not a typo. No. I believe, I mean, I'm a barrister, not a solicitor, but I believe solicitors have to do this in private practice too. Because it's the legal aid agency, they have to build a legal aid agency for what they're doing, or build a client, I guess, if they're doing private work.
6 minutes is crazy to me.
Well, I always invented my timesheets. I mean, I never, you know, I would just sort of do, 30 minutes and 60 minutes, but because I thought the whole thing was so ridiculous.
But it's just so fragmented. It's almost like let's give all of our staff ADHD and have this like frenetic.
It was frenetic. It was totally frenetic.
No deep work, no concentration.
No. I mean, it was all done frenetic is the only word for it, really. And constantly jumping from one thing to another and, being expected to take phone calls as they came in, not say, no, I'm working on a case, I've got to get to court by tomorrow morning. I need 3 hours to do this. I'm not taking any phone calls. Because we didn't have receptionists. We had to answer our own phones. And if you didn't answer, then you get this build-up of messages, and maybe some of them were urgent. I mean, they were terrible working conditions.
You talk about the use of consultants by local authorities. What were they being used for? Because, consultants is this expansive term. Every young person I speak to under 21 seems to want to be a consultant these days. What were they doing? Why did local management think that they would be a net positive for child protection?
I think the consultants were brought in to advise very senior sort of CEO level people in the local authority about how best to organise the legal department. It wasn't specifically for child protection, because the legal department, it deals with housing, it deals with highways, it deals with, all the different functions local authorities have in a city. So I think the point I was making was that they could have come and talked to the child protection legal team and asked what we needed. And we would have all said, confidentiality, we need little private places to talk to social workers and to make phone calls. But they didn't. And also, I mean, they didn't do anything that was at all helpful to us. And we felt they were presumably very expensive and a big waste of money.
So this would have been like McKinsey people or KPMG people. You don't know who, but
I don't know who it was. Could be KPMG.
One of these.
Yes. Yeah.
And they didn't get any feedback from you guys in terms of what work environment you'd like?
Well, I mean, I was never a manager, so whether the senior person in the legal department who sort of oversaw the child protection team, whether he or she spoke to them, I don't know. But certainly in terms of our experience at sort of ground level, there was no improvement. And because there was such an emphasis on we can't afford anything. Like, we can't afford to send you on training to keep you up to date with the law. We can't afford... At one point, I think in a different local authority, the paper we printed the court bundles on, this is before everything was digitised, was brown paper because white paper was too expensive. I mean, it didn't matter, but, that's how desperate it was. And sometimes you had to bring in your own barrows. I mean, local authorities have been in very dire straits for a lot of my working life.
I mean, yeah, cuts to local government, I think about 40%, isn't it, in real terms since 2010.
Yeah.
In terms of the very senior people, these consultants were advising CEO level, C-suite kind of management people, chief operations, chief executives, etc. What did you make of the people who were from your engagement with them, the kinds of people who would be a CEO or a chief operations officer of a local authority? Were they impressive people? Were they leaders?
I would say by and large, very lacking in communication skills. Whether or not they could lead, if they couldn't explain to us what they were doing and why, and show some concern for the difficulties of our work and our poor working conditions, that was so alienating that I think we probably mostly had a negative view of them. I'm sure they weren't all bad at what they were doing, but communication is so key, isn't it, in everything?
One of the things with local government is it's a difficult one because I'm on the left. I believe in the state. I think the state can, do really good things. It's hugely important. But at the same time, I'll often go through the local account, my local authorities' accounts. I'm in Portsmouth, so it's a unitary council. They have lots of power. And I'll look at, they'll have the head of regeneration. And they'll be on like 150, 160 grand, not including the pension and the various benefits. And I look around the city and I don't see much being regenerated.
No.
And then you see people working on the front line, like you say, whether it's lawyers or whether it's child protection or housing officers or whatever, they're worked to the bone.
Yeah.
And it seems so upside down to me.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. 100%.
We need a left-wing version of austerity, whatever that would be, where, you capsize that.
Yes.
That's not the right word.
Well, I think you have to cap the pay of senior people in local authorities. I don't think it's right that anybody should be on that kind of level of pay.
I mean, you've got CEOs on sort of $250,000. I mean, it's come down a bit, but crikey. I have a question for you, and this might seem like a curveball, but I think you'll probably have some really unique insights into it. It's about drugs. Because obviously you're talking about parents potentially with substance abuse issues. So somebody like Peter Hitchens, we've had him on, so it's a useful reference point. He hates cannabis. He thinks cannabis is the devil. I personally think it should be decriminalized. You've seen the impact it has for some people in terms of their ability to parent and so on. So what's your view on drug decriminalization as somebody who's, worked in this field?
I mean, if you mean specifically about cannabis, I would generally be a lot less worried about cannabis than about cocaine or heroin. I'm not mad keen on it. I wasn't keen on my son smoking it, and I was quite pleased when he stopped. He said it was making him paranoid, so he stopped. And I thought, that's good. What do I think? I guess I don't have a fixed view about decriminalisation. I've never felt convinced that was the right solution, but I've also often wondered why the police and the border people, why they can't stop this huge hauls of drugs being brought into the country more easily. Why is it so difficult? And, I don't really understand why so many prisons, there was that report yesterday, or was it this morning, about terrible conditions. An inspector of prisons was talking about terrible conditions in some prison that he'd been into recently, and that everybody in the prison was on drugs. And okay, maybe it's perceived as that makes the conditions slightly less intolerable if you're high, but surely they can stop the drugs getting into the prisons if they want to. It must be a matter of political will. Or
corruption. I'm not suggesting that's why in this prison, but
yeah, or corruption, yeah.
That's interesting. So you don't have a fixed view on it. That's interesting. Because I for somebody like Peter, as much as I might agree with him about decisions immediately preceding the Second World War or rearmament in the 1930s, I think, look, if you haven't really got any experience of substance abuse issues and how it's affected people's lives and how it impacts their ability to parent, then I'm not really that interested. Whereas somebody like you, I would be very interested in your views. If you were to say, actually, no, I'm quite reticent about cannabis decriminalization because I think it could cause a problem for a subsection of parents, I would take that seriously. But you don't think that, or?
I mean, I personally think skunk is an absolute menace, and I'd like to get rid of skunk. And if the best way to do that was to let people grow grass in their back gardens, then I would say, let's do that. But I don't feel, as you can tell, I don't feel very clued up about drugs really. And I certainly think cocaine has had a very bad influence on some parents, and it's exacerbated the level of violence that's gone on between parents in front of kids. I mean, it's just a pity that so many people in this country are so unhappy that they need drugs to make life bearable.
Mm.
And I'd like that to be addressed.
Yeah. So the cocaine's an interesting one. And what were the sorts of drugs that, and I'm asking this because, alcohol and substance abuse is a significant part of the reason why people can't get access to their kids. You have a wonderful persona, not a real person. These are built on real people, but they're personas, they're not real. Dwayne, who comes off cocaine and cannabis and gets his child back. Amazing story. But what kinds of drugs, generally speaking, are we talking about?
Crack cocaine and heroin, mainly. I mean, cannabis, it depends on the local authority. The more kind of rural authorities. I once came across a rural local authority that had a zero tolerance attitude to cannabis. But, if you went down the road to the nearest city, cannabis consuming parents were regarded as, well, okay. That's
so in
not
that
a big
authority,
deal.
somebody might lose their kids because they smoke cannabis in that rural.
I don't think they'd probably have lost their kids, but they certainly might have come to the attention of social workers, and possibly there could have been care proceedings. Let's say cannabis consumption linked with a bit of worry about domestic abuse or a bit of worry about neglect. And some time ago, but, this is one of the bizarre things about our child protection system, that in big urban areas, because all the resources are so stressed, the threshold at which a child is going to come to the attention of a social worker is much higher, low. I always get confused between the two. Your circumstances have to be much worse in a big city, generally, before a social worker will come and knock on your mum's door than in a little rural area.
And tell me about boarding schools. You have a very funny opinion on this. It made me think, and I couldn't help but think you were right.
To me, I've known a few, mainly men, who've been to boarding school who've been incredibly emotionally damaged by it. And it seems to me that it's a sort of form of emotional abuse, particularly sending children when they're quite young to boarding school, age 7 or 8, as some of, obviously I'm that much older, and some of my friends were sent at that age and were very damaged. And I've drawn a parallel between that and the kind of emotional abuse perpetrated by working class parents, which can lead to care proceedings. And I think it's appalling that we have this sort of double standard, that if you're wealthy and you effectively emotionally abandon your child by sending them off to somewhere where they'll be physically careful but they won't be loved, that's fine. You're a good parent. Whereas if you're a working class person and you work all the hours that God sends to pay the bills and to fill the prepayment meter, and so you've never got time to read your kid a bedtime story or tell them you love them, that is regarded as much more negligent.
I mean, my note here is that some people can effectively afford to be negligent parents. That's basically what boarding schools are.
That's the way I see it, yeah.
I think it's a great reframing. It's a great
reframing. I do know that some teenagers enjoy boarding school, and they would probably, I didn't go to boarding school. I mean, they would vehemently disagree with me. I'm talking more about sending kids of primary school age to boarding school.
Let's talk about COVID. I know you mentioned that a little bit earlier. What was the impact of COVID on your ability to safeguard kids and make sure that they were in the best possible conditions? Well,
I wasn't in a safeguarding role during COVID. I was acting for parents from my living room, which I talk about a lot in the book. I was living in the country at the time, and I was just pleased that I could earn my living through COVID and be occupied, quite honestly. I think I was very lucky. But from the point of view of the parents I represented, court proceedings went online. And I mean, it's one thing if your child's care proceedings had already started pre-COVID, so you would have met the social worker face-to-face, you'd have been to court, you'd know your lawyer. Okay, that might be less difficult. But for the parents whose cases started during COVID, of whom there were a great number, everything was done very remotely. So I would talk to a client the night before a hearing on the phone if I could get hold of them. I mean, sometimes we'd have quite long conversations, and then I would usually say, so how are you going to join the hearing? Have you got a laptop? Well, I learned not to ask that, but initially I asked that, and none of them had laptops. The local authorities were supposed to lend them laptops so that they could participate more easily, but in my experience, that didn't happen. So it would often be a mobile phone with a broken screen, sometimes mum and her boyfriend, or two parents, sitting closely together on a sofa looking at this screen. And I think it was very, very tough. And then, of course, I don't know that it could have been any better arrangements could have been made other than local authorities lending laptops to parents who had hearings. That would have involved driving around to the parents, handing over the laptop, at some risk of contamination, I suppose. I think probably that one of the most awful things for parents in COVID was that whereas they would have seen a child who was in foster care face to face once or twice a week or once or twice a month, suddenly it was all online. It was remote contact, so they'd see their child on a screen. And when they're with older kids, just about okay, but with small children, a baby, a toddler, a 3-year-old, they're not going to talk to mummy through a screen. They don't get what it's all about, or daddy. I mean, they just either they hear the familiar voice of the parent and they get upset because they really want to go home, or they just they're not going to sit and have a polite conversation. So I think that must have been extremely difficult for parents.
I ask because we're now a few years after those events, and there's a sensible conversation, I think, and it wasn't a sensible conversation for a very long time, about the costs of the lockdowns. And there's financial costs, of course, but there are also psychological, social costs too.
Yeah.
And the way you describe some of these processes, or as you said just a moment ago, a child having to go through that, that's going to stick with them for the rest of their lives, I think.
I thought so, yeah.
And on reflection, we had several lockdowns. I think the first one, you obviously have to do it. The second one, yeah. But I remember that winter lockdown in particular. Do you think that we weren't aware of the kinds of costs that we were creating down the line, and perhaps on reflection, we should have been a bit more, thoughtful about sort of the long-term after effects of such a extraordinary situation to impose, particularly on children?
Yeah, I think as a country, it's clear now, isn't it? We were totally unprepared for the pandemic and how to deal with it. I think I get the impression that there was very little thought given to the impact on children of closing the schools, and obviously it was a small number of children who were having to see their parents through screens, but they're a very important group of children, and children who are already traumatized. I think it's be fair to say not enough thought was given to it, but at the same time, the issue with the screen contact is that if a child's in foster care, the foster carer maybe has, children from 2 different families living with her. If she gets COVID because 2 of her children have gone off and seen mummy and caught COVID and come back and then given it to the household, that would have been incredibly serious. Some foster carers are lone parents, lone foster carers. If she's really ill and she's got 4 children, she's responsible for the well-being of 4 children. So I totally understand why it was a foster carer saying, look, I will not foster this child if you are going to allow face-to-face contact. And I totally understand why they said that. So I think it was an impossible situation, really.
It's interesting, just the more I talk to people about these various issues, that final lockdown, at the time I was obviously for it, but it really is food for thought. Final question. How would you improve child protection? You talked about potentially by 2030, 100,000 kids being affected by this. How would you improve it? And particularly, how would you improve it? Let's start with this, at low or no cost. So things that might be, and I agree, it's probably cost neutral, or actually it's going to save the taxpayer money, all of it in the long term. But what things wouldn't necessarily cost much money, but would make a major difference? And then we can talk about the stuff that does cost money.
Well, actually, one thing that wouldn't cost money, one thing we haven't really talked about is psychotherapy. And I feel very strongly that so many of the parents who end up in care proceedings have themselves had a deep level of childhood trauma and no help to deal with it. And inevitably, the results in their behaviour or their lifestyle of their childhood trauma gets spilled out onto their children. So basically, the trauma is getting passed down through generations. That fundamentally needs to be addressed. And at the moment, to get any sort of quality mental health support on the NHS is extraordinarily difficult. And I don't just mean since COVID. It's always been very difficult. But I've tried to research this for the book, and it's very difficult to get information. But it's basically, if you you have to go through your GP to get support, and parents would often be been told to go to the GP and would come back and say, oh yes, I'm on antidepressants, so it's all fine. When obviously it wasn't fine, it was just they were a bit more anaesthetised. I'm not saying that what might not be useful, but it doesn't get to the root of what's going on. So you can go to a GP and say you really want some sort of talking therapy of a sort, but in order to get psychotherapy, you have to be pretty much actively suicidal. And if you're actively suicidal, you shouldn't be caring for children anyway. Excuse me. So I think, and then there's the whole thing about the 26 weeks, that if through the fact that the local authorities become very concerned about your care of your children to the point where they're starting pre-proceedings or they're taking you into the family court in care proceedings, it's then too late to start therapy. And I wonder if the rules could be changed on access to what the NHS has got to offer, so that certain parents assessed by social workers to be A, wanting to do psychotherapy, and B, needing it, could be fast-tracked, so that, because I mean at the moment, even if you get to you go to your GP, you go on a long waiting list, you go through the low-level interventions, which are sort of tips on a website or a little bit of a chat with CBT in a group, maybe on the phone. It would be 2 or 3 years, even without having to be actively suicidal, before you really get any quality help. Well, I think that could be fast-tracked for those kind of parents, and that could be extremely helpful. And I don't see that would necessarily cost, but maybe NHS managers would say I've got that wrong.
Yeah, the persona of Dwayne, he has a child called Lawrence. So this is a guy who he's looking to raise his son by himself. He's a former drug addict. He's come off drugs. You do a hair test. He's doing really well. He's improving his life situation. But one of the sort of sticking points is that the fact he's not had therapy to talk about various traumas in the past. And of course, he can't afford it privately.
Yeah.
And you just think, crikey, a couple of grand here, and we would allow a child to live with his father.
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple of £1,000 is stopping that from happening.
Yeah, and that's absolutely bog standard. And often more than a couple of £1,000 will be spent if the parties can persuade a court to say that a psychological assessment of a parent is necessary, because that's the test. The psychological assessment will cost 3 or 4 grand, and it will say this parent needs X months worth, or maybe 18 months at the most, of a particular type of therapy. So the money's been spent, and then the local authority will say, as in the case of Kylie G that I talk about in the book, well, we can't afford it. We haven't got that money. And by then, usually that takes such a long time that you're getting towards the end of the 26 weeks, and they would add, anyway, it's too late. You know, we have to have a final care plan for these permanents for these children outside the family in 2 weeks' time or in 4 weeks' time.
And you also say in the book that a judge can't compel an authority to, give a parent, some kind of treatment, whereas perhaps that might be quite useful.
Oh, yes. No, I think there should be a power for a judge to be able to order that a parent is given therapy. But I mean, obviously that would cost. I may be wrong. I'm thinking that within the NHS, they have some resources. And if they could change their priorities so that parents who are likely to be facing care proceedings would get access more quickly, it wouldn't cost. But I may be wrong about that.
No, it's a relatively small number of people. So I think that seems sensible. Okay. Now onto the stuff that costs money.
Yeah.
We do have a magic money tree. How would you transform child protection for the better?
Well, I would use the Pause project as a model and look at how they work intensively. I mean, they work with women, but it could also be applied to men, but with some adaptations. Look at how they work intensively with, at the moment, with women who've lost a child in care proceedings, and use that as a model for working with parents or even young women who are pregnant who are struggling, and get that work in so much earlier on, in the hope that the lives of those people could be turned around to the benefit of their children. And I would also, and obviously this is more money, I would also want psychotherapy to be made available. I mean, not all parents are going to want it or be willing to engage, but for the ones who are, like Kylie G in the book, who's been through domestic abuse and sexual abuse, that should be made available early on and at no cost. Because you or I can afford to pay for therapy. These parents can't. And we're supposed to have a national health service. I mean, mental health is now recognised as being something incredibly important. So that would be my first thing. Second thing would be to rethink the recruitment and training and pay on offer to social workers I suppose in a way the word professionalise, comes to mind, but I don't mean to the exclusion of people who have little academic background, but a lot of insight into the communities they're working with. So I think there would have to be some way of working out that people could be recruited into social work who don't have high-flying academic qualifications, but they would need to be given the support so that they could write clearly and communicate clearly in court situations. And as we talked about earlier, then I think the training needs to be much more in-depth and much longer, and the pay needs to reflect the fact that this is a really serious, difficult job, and there should be status attached. I mean, why do I have more status as a lawyer than the person next door who's a social worker? I mean, it's ridiculous. Actually, I've probably had less power to do harm in my working life than she has. It's crazy. The 26 weeks we've talked about, I think that really needs looking at and made much more flexible. And then the other thing I've talked about in the book is research. That, again, this is rather bizarre, but at the moment there's no longitudinal research on how the decisions made by the family court on a child have impacted that person as a young person and as an adult.
Just to be clear, longitudinal means, over time.
Yeah, over time, over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. It would be fascinating research to do, and I think most judges would really, really welcome it. And it would deepen their craft, their ability to make the decisions that they need to make.
I thought that was such an interesting insight, actually, because it's obvious. We talk about evidence-based policy, we talk about we're a scientific culture, blah, blah, blah. But we have no idea, actually, what kinds of interventions work and which ones don't. Exactly. Extraordinary. Teresa, this was a great conversation. It's a great book. I knew nothing about child protection, even though my mum was in the industry not so long ago. But I really do recommend it, actually, to anyone. It's always good, I think, to read outside of your area of specialisation. Teresa Thornhill, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.